from the world of politics.
I think Congress is, by and large, viewed as totally useless these days. And that's not only hurting Joe Biden's effectiveness in terms of his popularity, it's hurting America in the world.
To the world of business.
No one, though, is going to be very happy until inflation actually comes down. I don't think there's any great way to message 8% inflation.
This is Balance of Power with David Westin.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our television and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power, where President Biden is about to go out to Los Angeles to preside over a summit for the Americas. And for an update on exactly what we should expect from him, we turn now to our Washington correspondent, Joe Matthew. He's host of Sound On weekdays on Bloomberg Radio. So what is this Summit of the Americas about, Joe?
Well, it's interesting, David. Before he takes off, the president does have a public event here today. He's going to be signing a number of bills, 9 bills, to increase access for veterans' health care. But of course, he's packing for and planning for a very important trip. And this summit does not come without some controversy, David. The president's going to leave tomorrow. One person who will not be there is the president of Mexico, who is essentially boycotting the event in protest of the administration's decision to not invite Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. President Obrador is saying that he doesn't think this is appropriate at the time, but he also was careful to say that he is going to miss Joe Biden. He sent him a virtual hug and even blamed Republicans for the United States' tough stance on Cuba. So you can look at this a couple of different ways. We also expect him to be here, the president of Mexico, next month for a meeting with the president here at the White House. Immigration and other major issues will be on the table. As far as this trip goes, though, you don't send the president on a West Coast swing without domestic politics in mind, David. Tomorrow, he's going to sit for a taping on the Jimmy Kimmel Show. And on Friday, he's going to deliver a speech from the Port of L.A., in which he'll tout the administration's efforts to try to unwind problems in the supply chain and help to lower inflation. All roads, David, lead back to inflation, even as this president heads to Los Angeles.
Yeah, indeed they do. Thank you so much, Joe Matthew, for that report from the White House. You can catch Joe on the radio every day of the week at 5 p.m. Eastern Time on Bloomberg Sound On. So at the same time, we want to talk about the economy and what's going on in the economy. Earlier today, we heard from the World Bank, and they took the estimate down on global growth from 3.2% to 2.9%. Earlier today on Bloomberg, President David Malpass of the World Bank talked about the possibilities of a recession.
The downside risk is that it could be a global recession. One of the key variables is whether supply comes back online in order to add growth and slow down the inflation rate. But this is the sharpest slowdown in 80 years.
For his views on where we are in the recession, at least in this country, the United States of America, we turn now to Tyler Goodspeed. He's a fellow at the Hoover Institution. Dr. Goodspeed served as acting chair of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Trump. Tyler, great to have you back with us. I won't ask you about the globe, but about the United States and the chances of inflation. And just to tell you, Bloomberg Economics today came out with an estimate which was 1 in 4 chance in 2022 of a recession in the United States, but it goes up to 75% in 2023. Does that sound right to you?
Thanks, David. It's always good to talk with you. Yes, that does sound about right. Look, in any given year, the unconditional probability of a recession is about 15%. I think it's higher in 2022 than usual, probably about 30%. And then much higher than that in 2023. I think many of us have heard the figure that Larry Summers likes to cite, which is accurate. You can fact check it, that if you look over the entire post-1945 period, when inflation is over 4% and unemployment rate below 4%, the probability of a recession beginning in the next 2 years is about 100%.
And that leads us, I think, pretty directly back to the Federal Reserve. We're going to get some CPI numbers out Friday morning this time. What are you looking for in those CPI numbers, and what will the Fed take away from them in all likelihood?
So I'm expecting it to tick back up a bit in May relative to April, driven largely by energy prices. But I'm really going to be looking at the various measures of so-called underlying or sticky inflation, the components that are really durable, and in particular, how much of this inflation is spreading or continuing to spread into services.
And what can the Fed do about this at this point as a practical matter? I mean, they seem to be on a path for 50 basis point rate hikes for the next couple at least. I'm not sure how many it is they're going to go 50. But at what point do they need to either keep the pedal down to the metal or do they need to back off?
Well, so when we look at the latest GDP numbers, when we look at the latest labor market data, it shows that the inertial components of the U.S. economy are still showing a lot of signs of strength. Now, that to me says that the Fed is going to have to continue with the tightening, and whereas I think a lot of people were expecting that they might pause in September, I think it might instead be sort of going from 50 to 25 rather than an outright pause. What I'm still scratching my head about is why government economists, including the Federal Reserve, including the Congressional Budget Office, are still believing in this concept of immaculate disinflation, that somehow inflation is going to come down pretty much on its own while the unemployment rate remains below their estimates of potential and output remains above their estimates of potential. So I just don't know how they're squaring that circle.
Is it team transitory as it's come to be called? I mean, is this basically a hope that in fact some of the supply chain kinks will get unraveled?
I think that's ultimately what it comes down to, is that they're now talking the talk of saying this inflation is serious and we're going to have to get a hold of it. But the walk that they're walking is still one of team transitory, unfortunately.
Let me ask you about another thing that has really come up quite a bit, and that is the liquidity coming out of the marketplace. And this is global to some extent. It's not just the Fed that is starting to tighten here. What effect is that likely to have as we go forward to try to keep the economy going?
So it's certainly uncharted waters. We haven't been in a situation where we have all of the major central banks engaged in asset runoff or quantitative tightening at the same time. One of my colleagues recently referred to it as taper tandem. It will have an effect on tightening, probably not as much as the interest rate hikes that certainly the Fed is going to follow through on, and the ECB and the Bank of England. But here, I think, is where things could get complicated when it comes to a Fed pause or U-turn, because when we look back to the experience of the 1970s, it wasn't an equity market correction that triggered each of the Fed pauses or U-turns. It was actually concerns about market functioning and about inflation sort of coming down. So I think those are the sorts of things that could trigger a Fed pause come later this year.
Tyler, as we look back in history, because you really are an economic historian, you've done a lot of work in this area, I wonder if there's one thing that may be different this time than from some of the prior slowdowns we've seen in response to Fed tightening, and that is the strength of the household balance sheet. Because there's still over $2 trillion, I believe, still sitting on the balance sheet for consumers to spend.
Right, and it's not just households. It's households, it's businesses, and it's state and local governments. So I think that if we do enter a recession in the next 2 years, we would be entering that recession with household, business, and state and local government balance sheets in pretty much their strongest position they've been in historically at the start of a recession. I think that we could be looking at a recession. The most probable recessionary scenario that I'm looking at would be actually more like some of the recessions of the 1960s and 1970s, where we get some big swings in the more volatile components of GDP, investment, and within investment, inventory investment. And that's sort of what we saw already in the first quarter of this year, where we had a big swing in inventory investment. And we're starting to hear some whispers of that from a lot of major retailers, that they underbought in early 2021, then they overbought, and so there could now be some swings in inventory investment that drive overall GDP.
And finally, Tyler, one of the things we're hearing coming out of this White House is that President Putin is responsible for a lot of what we're seeing in inflation. And there's been some poo-pooing of that, saying, come on, you can't blame it all on Putin. At the same time, don't they sort of have a point when it comes to energy costs as well as food costs right now? But for this war, it would not look as bad as it does right now, would it?
So I have two thoughts on that. One is that it's certainly driving inflation higher in the euro area. And the increase in inflation in the past few months has been higher in the euro area than in the United States. But my second thought is when you look at the divergence of core inflation between the United States and the euro area. So core inflation, stripping out volatile food and energy, and it's a much better gauge of sort of the underlying inflationary dynamics. That divergence occurred in March 2021, and by the start of the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the increase in the rate of core inflation in the United States was about 5 times that in the euro area. And core inflation in the United States continues to run at a much hotter pace than in the euro area. So that to me says that yes, energy has been a factor, but in terms of the underlying drivers of this inflationary pressure, they predated the invasion of Ukraine.
Tyler, that's a terrific analysis. Thank you so much for sharing it with us. That's Tyler Goodspeed of the Hoover Institution. Coming up, we get the view from the White House on the state of the economy with David Bernstein of the Council of Economic Advisors. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. I want to keep you up to date with news from all around the world. For that, we turn to Ritika Gupta here with First Word.
Thanks, David. The Uvalde school shooting, an upcoming Supreme Court decision on abortion, and federal immigration policies are all providing fodder for domestic extremists threatening violence to the U.S. That is according to the Department of Homeland Security in its latest National Terrorism Advisory System bulletin. The DHS says in coming months it expects the threat environment to become more dynamic as, quote, several high-profile events could be exploited to justify acts of violence. Boris Johnson is trying to draw a line under the controversy that's been threatening his leadership, but the scale of a mutiny against the British Prime Minister suggests his days may be numbered. Johnson survived a confidence vote by members of his own Conservative Party. Still, more than 40% of Tory MPs voted against him. Johnson now says it is time to get back to helping people with the cost of living. And Hong Kong won't tighten coronavirus restrictions before the city's July 1st handover anniversary. That is according to Chief Executive Carrie Lam. There's been speculation that China's President Xi Jinping might attend the celebrations. Hong Kong's COVID cases have been rising since the city began rolling back social distancing curbs. Global News 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg. David.
Thank you so much, Ritika. So we want to turn back to the economy now, because it is the big story for all of the United States of America and certainly for Wall Street. And when it comes to the economy, number one question, of course, it has to do with inflation. For some answers to how the fight is going at the White House, we turn now to Dr. David Bernstein. He's a member of the President's Council of Economic Advisors. Jared, thank you so much for spending time with us once again. Give us a sense of how that battle is going. I saw that President Biden basically said there's not much he can do to really affect food and gas prices in the short term. Is that right?
Well, I think the president has been very clear, and he emphasized in an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal about a week ago that fighting inflation is his top domestic priority. He grew up in a family where high gas prices, high food prices were kitchen table issues just like they are today. So there's a real empathy there that has led him to dispatch his team to do everything we can do. Now, I think there is an important division between what we can do at the White House and what the Federal Reserve can do. The first and foremost institution fighting inflation right now is, of course, the Fed. And the president's first plank of his three-plank approach is Federal Reserve independence. Now, that certainly makes a real distinction between our approach and that of the previous administration. The other two planks have a lot to do with what we're trying to do to help mitigate cost increases, what we're trying to do with Congress, and very importantly, bringing the budget deficit down to get a kind of a negative fiscal impulse in the mix so that government is complementing monetary policy through its fiscal policy.
And we've seen a fair amount of the deficit reduction and what's happened year to year, although a lot of that is, frankly, on cutting back some spending for having to do with the pandemic, I believe. But at the same time, we've had Janet Yellen, the former head of the Federal Reserve, now the Secretary of Treasury, just up on the Hill today saying she expects inflation to remain relatively high. Is that the expectation from the White House? And is that what the American people should get used to?
I'll answer that in a second, but I also want to just unpack the earlier part of your question. You said something about the deficit, the budget deficit coming down by a fair amount, so I'm going to push back there. It's really an historic amount. $1.7 trillion. That's not our number. That's the Congressional Budget Office this fiscal year. Now, you said that a lot of that is fiscal policy rolling off, and that's true. But about half of it is revenues coming in a lot stronger than anticipated. And that increased revenue flow into our Treasury is directly linked to the strong economy. Strongest recovery on record by many metrics, as you and I have discussed before. Tightest labor market on record, and we can go through some of those numbers. But I just want to be clear, it's not just a fair amount, it's an historic amount of deficit reduction. I think from the inflation perspective, where that helps is that it is a fiscal policy that takes government more out of the mix in terms of stimulating growth. Now, in terms of the inflation outlook, look, I'll just cite pretty much every forecast I've seen, which has inflation moderating over the course of this year and next. Certainly the Fed's forecast underscores that. But we're not really in that kind of forecasting business. We're in the business of doing everything we can to help ensure that those forecasts come to pass. And again, I'm happy to talk about the agenda as I outlined earlier, and as the president did in his op-ed.
Well, let's come back to that. That's exactly right. And by the way, always correct me on my adjectives. I got to be careful about those adjectives. And please always correct me, Jared. Don't be shy. I know you have a tendency to be shy. But let's come back to the agenda. I understand you'd like Congress to do various things. Maybe it will, but I have to tell you right now, looking at Congress, I don't see a lot of promise there. I hope you're right, but I'm not sure you're right. Apart from Congress, what can the executive branch do on the question of inflation?
Okay, great question. So there's what can we do, there's also what have we done. One of the stories that I noted today, this morning, had to do with both the trade deficit, which came in considerably lower than expected this month, particularly on the back of strong exports, and also high levels of inventories in some of our large retailers, leading them to probably reduce their prices to some degree. Now, both of those relate to something that we've been working on for months here, which is trying to unsnarl supply chains through our work in the ports. We have a port envoy, John Picari, who is working in LA and Long Beach to bring down the dwell time of containers, which has been a real success, and generally increase the throughput of goods from ship to shelf. And that's helped to stock the shelves to a level that's much like that pre-pandemic. By the way, to be clear, I'm not talking about baby formula, of course, which is a whole other set of interventions that we've been engaged in. Now, in terms of looking forward, the president has, of course, presided over a release of oil from the strategic reserves. We're going to continue to push on that. We're also going to continue to push on oil producers to meet their quotas or even exceed them. And that's why the OPEC announcement of last week to increase their quota was an important one as well. But we're not going to give up on the congressional agenda. We absolutely can't do that. When families are facing exacerbated costs in prescription drugs and health care and education and housing, we're going to do everything we can to get Congress on board in helping the American people to face this inflationary challenge. They talk about it just as much as we do. They need to pony up on the policy side the same way we're doing.
And Jared, finally, my understanding since it was created as the Council of Economic Advisors is in the business, a think tank, as it were, on the economy for the president to give him an honest read on where the economy is. There's a report from Bloomberg Economics out today that says in 2022, the chances of recession in the United States is about 25%, 1 in 4 or so, which is slightly above what the normal rate would be.
Yeah.
But in 2023, they say it's 75%, 3 in 4. Now, I understand this is a bell curve. There's a distribution, but is that a reasonable approximation of what you're telling the president?
You know, we really are not going to get into recessionary probabilities. We certainly track the Growth Watch very carefully. Right now, the modal forecast, not our own, I'm talking about market forecast, is for the pace of growth to slow from well north of 5%, so well above trend, to around trend or even slightly below. Now, the president in his op-ed emphasized that he believed that this was precisely where the economy needed to go, from an above-trend, breakneck, V-shaped growth path that characterized the economy coming out of the pandemic recession to a much steady, stabler transition. And that's what all of our policy is geared to, and that's what we're talking to the president about.
Okay, Jared, as I say, it's always a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you for your time. That's Jared Bernstein at the Council of Economic Advisors at the White House. Still to come, we're going to talk about the state of the Russian war in Ukraine with retired general and former CIA director David Petraeus. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.
This June, in honor of Pride Month and Juneteenth, Bloomberg brings you a special equality series every Thursday in June at 1 p.m. Eastern. Bloomberg Equality, celebrating inclusion this Pride Month and all year long.
This is Balanced Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. I want to check in on the markets right now, and one of the things that's interesting is what's going on in retail. And Kriti Gupta is here to tell us about it. Kriti?
Well, the Target saga continues, David, in that in the last 3 weeks already Target has cut their profit guidance twice, and it's all about one thing. It's about inventory. And let's put this into some broader context, because we all know that the retailers are dealing with higher inventory, decelerating sales. But how did we really get here? And that's, I think, a very important question to ask. Because we got here when a lot of these retailers and companies were faced with a dynamic of supply chain issues. Think about it. Can the product come out of Shanghai or Beijing or the ports in China that were shut down? If they do come out, are there issues in the shipping rates? Does it get more expensive? Will the consumers actually eat those costs? Or if you'll remember the story with Evergiven, the ship that was stuck and had a lot of product delays, right? So a lot of these companies said, well, we have to prepare for this. So we are going to essentially build up our inventory so we don't deal with this. What they didn't take into account was decelerating sales. So one of the major kind of metrics that a lot of people are looking at for retailers right now, and as a proxy for that consumer story, is inventories relative to sales. And right now, that ratio is very, very high.
But are the sales themselves slowing down, or is it just they built up too much inventory? I mean, how does it compare with pre-pandemic, for example, the sales rate?
Well, the sales are slowing down. They are. And this isn't a surprise. You see this across sectors. You even see it with tech. But the concern here, and really what the stock is reacting to, what the forecasts are reacting to, is not what the consumer is doing right now. What are they going to do at the end of the year, holiday season? What are they going to do back to school? It's going to be the next couple of quarters that they're saying, well, that's really where you're going to see a more marked deceleration. And that's the concern that a lot of companies have, that sure, things are fine right now. Will they be fine in a couple of quarters?
And this is before we get to the Port of Los Angeles, right? Which could go on strike still.
Yes, which is very much a possibility. And once again, this comes back to one of the concerns, or some of the concerns that a lot of these retailers had about protecting the inventory and making sure that if there is this booming demand from the American consumer, which by all indication there is, can they fulfill it? Can they meet it? You've seen a lot of companies, I'm going to use chip companies, for example, who have had this soaring demand and aren't able to meet it because they simply don't have the capacity or the supply chains or whatever it is. And right now, retailers aren't in the exact same spot, but they are worried about it.
It's a fascinating story. Thank you so much, Kriti, for bringing it to us. It's Kriti Gupta on the markets. You can catch Kriti again at 1 p.m. Eastern Time on Bloomberg Markets, where she's an anchor. Coming up, President Putin claims Russian progress in eastern Ukraine, even as his economy suffers. We get this strategic overview from retired General David Petraeus. That's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. To keep you up to date with news from all around the world, we turn now to Ritika Gupta here with the first word. Ritika?
Thanks, David. Russian President Vladimir Putin is warning that key sectors of his country's economy are facing major slowdowns. He singled out the auto sector, where nearly all car plants have shut because of a lack of imported parts. Sanctions have hit Russia hard. Official forecasts show the country is facing one of the deepest downturns in years. But at a meeting with his top officials today, Putin also touted record low unemployment and the strength of the ruble. Several thousand migrants started walking through southern Mexico early today. It is the largest migrant caravan to attempt to leave the region this year. Mexico's asylum agency has been overwhelmed by the surging number of applicants. Restrictive policies have made applying for asylum in Mexico one of the few routes migrants have to legalize their status and be able to continue traveling north. And the U.S. has warned Kim Jong-un there will be a strong punishment if North Korea conducts a nuclear test. Both Washington and a United Nations watchdog agency say there are signs that North Korea could soon set off its first atomic device since 2017. Kim's regime has been test-firing missiles at a record pace this year. And NASA will launch 3 rockets from a facility in Australia's Northern Territory later this month. It will be the first time the space agency has used a commercial launch pad outside of the US in its more than 50-year history, and it'll be the first NASA launch in Australia since 1995. The rockets will be used by NASA to investigate phenomena which can only be seen from the South Hemisphere. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg. David.
Thank you so much, Ritika. Well, the war in Ukraine continues apace, perhaps not the way that President Putin would have intended it to go, but nonetheless, it continues, particularly in the eastern part of the country, in Ukraine, that Donbas region. For a report now on where we stand in that war and where the Ukrainian forces stand, we turn now to retired General David Petraeus, who commanded coalition forces in Iraq and Afghanistan, served as director of the CIA, and is now chairman of the KKR Global Institute. He comes to us today from a BNP Paribas conference where he is speaking on the subject of geopolitical risks. General, thank you so much for being with us. Give us a sense of what we know about what's going on in the East. I saw that the defense minister of Russia today came out and said they now have taken over 97% of Luhansk, which is only one of the 2 provinces, right?
It is, and the fighting does continue still in the very crucial city of Severodonetsk in Luhansk Oblast, that province. The Russians have made gains, and then the Ukrainians have actually pushed them back. So by no means have the Russians completely consolidated their control in that very critical city, even though the Russians continue to pour resources into it. And I think the hope of the Ukrainians is that as the Russians are seized by that particular fight, that they are able to come at the Russians from the flank. So from the west, pushing towards Crimea and collapsing that particular flank and retaking a very important city of Kherson, Kherson, and then also from Kharkiv to push down along the border there to take advantage of the Russia's preoccupation with Severodonetsk and Luhansk and start to collapse the edges of that. Now, it's by no means certain that they'll be able to do that, but I think they want to do that before the Russians are able to take whatever it is that they're going to take additional in Luhansk Oblast, and then start to harden the front lines of all of this and perhaps run some kind of rump referendum, which the results say they will report that everyone wants to be part of the Russian Federation. And so Russia will then annex those areas and make them part of the Federation.
So, General, one of the things we hear about, at least read about, is the possibility of this so-called double envelopment, which, as I understand it, would sort of cut off a fair amount of the Ukrainian forces, actually capture those Ukrainian forces. Is that as key as some people in the media are making it to be? Is that a key element?
It is a risk. And so you have this sort of elbow, if you will, and Russian forces are all around it. You have Severodonetsk right in the crux of that elbow. And what the Russians would love to do is actually close off all those that are out there and take away their ability to withdraw. I don't think that's going to happen. I think the Ukrainians are very, very keenly aware of the potential of that, and they're doing everything they can to mitigate the risk of such an envelopment, because they could lose quite a number of forces and capabilities there. But that does remain a threat, and it does remain something the Russians have sought to do. Originally, they wanted to do a very large envelopment, and they've actually scaled their plans back to a much more modest one. But it still could have very negative consequences for Ukrainian forces if the Russians are able to pull that off.
General, one of the things we've been told is that a key role potentially of some of the armaments being provided to the Ukrainians from the United States and others, particularly some of the sophisticated missile systems, is to try to attack the supply lines of the Russians, that might be their vulnerability. How is that going? How important is that? And are the reports overblown that they're having trouble training up the Ukrainians to use those sophisticated missile systems?
No, I think it is very much one thing to provide these extraordinary capabilities, and it's another to actually be able to employ them. And we have provided massive quantities of arms and ammunition. I mean, 220,000 rounds of heavy artillery. That is just enormous. Again, having invaded a country as a two-star general and knowing the numbers of what we shot and so forth, this is a staggering quantity. Now, it is important because this has become, in many respects, a war of artillery, rockets, missiles, and so forth. And also a war of drones, and the Ukrainians have effectively used drones so they can look into the rear of the Russian forces. They can identify the locations at which they have their logistical bases and so forth. And they've been pretty successful at taking those out, just as they were successful at taking out that bridge crossing effort that the Russians sought to perform. But again, it's really going to be very, very important in the next few weeks to see how well the Ukrainian forces are absorbing all of what the U.S. and other NATO and non-NATO Western countries are providing to Ukraine, and how able they are to get it into the front lines, to employ it, to push the Russians back. And in particular, if they can come at these flanks and try to collapse parts of the Russian defenses before they get too hardened.
General, another front, if I can put it that way, in this war is economic. The sanctions that have been imposed on Russia. And we heard President Putin today admitting it is hurting his economy. It is less than it should be, and the damage may still be coming. As a practical matter, can economic sanctions like that actually play a role in a shooting war, or does that have a different purpose?
Well, the purpose over time, I think, is to erode Russia's capability, number one, to actually replace the losses. I mean, Russia's almost lost 1,000 tanks alone. It's way, way over 4,000 major items of various weapon systems and vehicles. With these export controls on chips going to them, other sanctions, the sanctions on the economy as a whole, and the financial system, on Putin's inner circle, all of this makes it increasingly difficult for them to keep various industries going. And we now know that, of course, the Secretary of the Treasury in the US is identifying the supply chains of major industries and basically going after the components of those supply chains to inflict further damage on Russia's economy. You heard again Vladimir Putin say today that it's down. The estimates are that it will be down by at least 10% in GDP. That's a serious recession. And if it continues over time, and some of the damage is irreparable. You know, there's about 1,000 US and other Western firms that have either withdrawn completely or shuttered what it is that they do in Russia. And a number of those major companies, the major oil production companies and others, they're not going back. They're certainly not going back if Vladimir Putin is still the president. And they'll take a very, very hard look if at some point in time he's succeeded by someone else, to see whether it really is the kind of climate in which they can invest.
General Petraeus,
so yeah, there's an element.
Sorry.
But at the end of the day, remember that Vladimir Putin's looking in the mirror in the morning, and he doesn't see someone who made a catastrophically bad decision. He sees the proud, strong, robust leader of the Russian people who have withstood Napoleon and Hitler's armies and all the rest. They know how to suffer, and he is intent on continuing this to the max extent that they possibly can.
Finally, briefly here at the end, General, as I mentioned, you're at this BNP Paribas conference talking about geopolitical risk broadly and going beyond Ukraine. Talk about China, because we did see that chief economist from a think tank over in China today say that they may need to liberate Taiwan to get TSMC if there are sanctions put against them. Is that your number one or number two geopolitical risk?
Well, I would actually say that the real issue for geopolitics is just the relationship between the U.S. and the West and China. It's a very, very complex relationship. It's not something from which we can withdraw completely. It is, in the words of Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, severe competition. It's that entire ecosystem, really, that we've got to be very concerned about. How do we invest in China responsibly as well as legally? How do we take their money and allow it to be invested in the U.S. and the West? These are very, very challenging issues. And you see China with its economic slowdown. The zero COVID policy has obviously not worked all that well. You shut down the entire city of Shanghai as part of that. Demographic decline, debt to GDP ratio, all of these issues with which they're wrestling. And of course, they became a partner with no limits with a man who is now an international pariah, Vladimir Putin. So I think it's the overarching relationship, one component of which is ensuring, from our perspective and that of our allies and partners around the world, that deterrence is very strong, and that perceptions of our capabilities and our will do not lead someone to make a catastrophic decision that could lead to conflict between our two countries.
General, it's always so terribly helpful to have you with us. Thank you so much. That's retired General David Petraeus, chairman of the KKR Global Institute. Coming up, we get an update on COVID and what we need to do to make sure we're ready for what comes next with Dr. Leslie Kantor of the Rutgers School of Public Health. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. There's an awful lot in the news these days, and we can almost overlook COVID, but it is still very much with us, with people getting infected every day and, frankly, dying every day. To bring us up to speed on where we are and what we should expect, we welcome now Dr. Leslie Kantor. She's chair of the Department of Urban Global Health at Rutgers University. Doctor, great to have you back with us. So give us your sort of overall view about where we are in fighting COVID right now.
Yeah, unfortunately, we really are in a wave in the United States. We're averaging 100,000 cases that we know of every day. And people who model this disease think that probably cases are 5 to 10 times higher than that because so many people are relying on at-home tests, which are not easy to report. So lots of cases. The good news is hospitalizations have remained low. And while there are deaths, unfortunately, every day, we're not seeing the numbers that we did during earlier forms of this virus, like Delta or like the original virus.
And do you give credit largely to vaccines for that phenomenon, that we don't see the same thing? And I guess the follow-on question is, what's the risk of a new mutation of this disease that comes back that maybe beats the vaccines?
So it's clear that vaccines are holding up extremely well against very serious disease and death. It also seems to be true that the current variants that are in circulation, which are these subvariants of Omicron, do not cause the same level of severe illness as Delta. So those things are good news for sure.
And let me ask you also about Paxlovid, if I could, this treatment that came out of Pfizer, and that the United States government has bought an awful lot of Paxlovid to give out. There's cases, and anecdotal cases that I've heard about at least, of people getting a disease, taking Paxlovid, getting better, and then having a rebound that feels worse than what they had to begin with. Do we know anything about the rebound problems with Paxlovid?
So we know there have been enough cases of suspected rebound that the CDC has put out a health advisory. What seems to happen is that people take these very powerful antivirals for 5 days, and then some proportion of people 2 to 8 days later either return to testing positive or to some symptoms. Now, the CDC's advisory is very clear that what we don't know is whether that's really about Paxlovid or whether that might be the natural course of disease in some people. And in fact, I've looked back at the data from the original trial on Paxlovid, and you did see some of these rebound cases in the placebo group, which suggests that it's very important for people to be aware, even when they're done and they've tested negative, if they are going to be around vulnerable people, it's worth continuing to test, to monitor symptoms. And the CDC does say if you return to symptoms and testing positive, you should re-isolate for the 5 days plus 5 days of masking after that.
Dr. Kantor, we're about to go into the fall, and typically in the fall, in recent years, we've been concerned about getting back indoors and spikes in cases. Should we be concerned about that, and what advice would you have for us to prepare for the fall and the winter?
Sure. So I think seasonality is a little bit different in different parts of the country because, of course, there are some parts of the country where it's getting so hot that everybody is going inside now to be in the air conditioning, and that could drive a wave. For example, last year, we saw a big wave in the South in August. People do need to adapt to what the virus is dishing up to us and to their local conditions. Given the level of transmission in this country, I would absolutely suggest to people that they mask when indoors, that they think about when they're going to be around vulnerable people. And certainly we would hope that if people recover from infection right now, that might protect them in the fall. Please don't shoot the messenger. Apparently in South Africa, there are some new variants still of Omicron, but they've already named BA4 and BA5.
More coming. Such good news. But finally here, as we think about how to go forward, how important is it to get more boosters? Should we be expecting one a year? Because there was a big push on to get vaccination to begin with. We had that vaccine hesitancy. Do we need to be making an effort as a nation, as states, or more locally to make sure people get their boosters?
Clearly, it's very important to know that for people 50 and up, boosters are now recommended if it has been 4 months or more since your last vaccine. We know that immunity wanes over time. That's part of why we see people who are vaccinated getting infected and having mild illness. So yes, boosters are very, very important, and we're just going to have to stay up to date.
Doctor, thank you so much for being back with us. Really appreciate that. That's Dr. Leslie Kantor of the Rutgers School of Public Health. Coming up, we go through Boris Johnson's status as prime minister after that vote of his party yesterday. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. There's a big vote yesterday over in the United Kingdom where the Conservative Party decided whether they wanted to keep Prime Minister Boris Johnson as their leader, and he won, although by not as wide a margin as maybe he would have preferred. For an update on where this stands right now, we turn to Bloomberg's Lizzie Burden, who covers European economics for Bloomberg. Lizzie, thank you so much for being with us at this late hour in your time. Give us a sense of where Prime Minister Johnson is. I must say, when I heard it, I was traveling yesterday. I called one of my British friends. I said he won. And he said, well, don't be too fast with that decision.
Exactly. It's victory for Boris Johnson, but the question is now how long can he cling on? The rules currently state that there can't be another vote like this for another year, but Johnson's opposition inside his own party say, well, let's change the rules. And if you look at history, at Johnson's predecessors, Theresa May, Margaret Thatcher, they clung on only for 6 months and a day respectively after they won their confidence votes. And actually, Theresa May had a bigger majority, a smaller rebellion, than Johnson had. And Johnson's rebels outnumber his majority before the vote. So it's going to be very difficult to get through his legislative agenda now, including, there's just some breaking news, a story from RTE. The UK government wants to introduce a bill that will allow future ministers to fundamentally override the Northern Ireland Protocol by emphasising the UK internal market over the EU single market. Now, post this vote, that's going to be hard to get past these emboldened pro-EU Conservatives, and it's also going to be hard to get compromise out of Brussels, especially when Johnson's looking so weak.
Given the challenges to the Prime Minister at the moment, is it possible that that sort of move by the British government is actually try to garner more support from the people? That is Boris Johnson saying, you know what, if I appeal to the people and say I'm going to be really tough on Brussels, they'll like me better.
Well, you know, Brexit is so divisive in Britain, and I think what's interesting about the vote that took place yesterday is it almost took us by surprise that we got to this 54 letters to trigger a vote of no confidence, and the reason was that the rebels were so random in nature, so disparate, because you had Brexiters, Remainers, MPs from the north and the south, young and old, and so they all submitted their letters to the chairman of this Conservative committee, Sir Graham Brady, and then by surprise they passed the threshold and we had the vote. And so if he plays this hard Brexit card, it's a gamble. Who is he actually going to please, and whose feathers are he going to ruffle?
And goodness knows we've never seen Boris Johnson gamble before, right, Lizzie? Thank you so much. Really great to have you with us. It's Bloomberg's Lizzie Burden reporting from number 10, it looks like. Check out the Balance of Power newsletter on the terminal and online. Coming up, Balance of Power continues on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, we'll talk to Loyola Marymount's Fernando Guerra about the LA mayor primary.